Hey guys, Aura here, and welcome to Aura Boxer. In today's video, we're going to be going into a deep dive for Shadowlands Retribution Paladin for Season 2. I felt that this guide needed to come out because there's been some information being released basically saying that Retribution Paladins are sub-tier, and I want to help you guys prove that to be wrong. So there is going to be a couple of updates from my previous guides. They're still relevant, so I'll put the links in the description below. But from personal experience, there's a few things to be tweaked. So let's get into it. I will say while we transition that this isn't going to be a gameplay-based video. So sit back, enjoy your cuppa, whatever it is you're doing today, and just listen as I kind of explain how everything goes. So we will start off with the Covenant. Now, as a Retribution Paladin, the main Covenant in question for us is Kyrian. We get the most benefit out of it due to its 1 minute cooldown Covenant ability, Divine Toll. However, if you're Venthyr, because you main Pros or Holy, or even one of the other two Covenants being Night Fae or Necrolord because you prefer the aesthetic or whatever, we will still go into bits and pieces there for you, so this is a full comprehensive deep dive. This is not going to be Kyrian specific. My tips and tricks, however, will be related to Kyrian because I am Kyrian, so I can best give those tips. So, as I've already said, Kyrian is the best. However, the second most popular Covenant, due to its strengths for Protection and Holy, is Venthyr. So as a result, we will also briefly go over the Venthyr Soulbind options. But for Kyrian itself, we are looking at using Pelagos. Pelagos still remains our best one. There were murmurings when I released my previous videos that Pelagos might win out once a Fuse Anima Accelerator was unlocked. However, due to practical purposes of Bronn, although we get Bronn frequently, his knockback on arrival can be detrimental in some keys. It can be beneficial in others if it's caster heavy. For instance, the adds going to the caster boss, Kultharok, in Theatre of Pain. When you have all those souls that are casting slow on the target, you can freedom them, you can kick them, or if you're lucky and you time it right, Bronn can be a mass interrupt, which is quite fortunate, but unfortunately his cons outweigh his pros as a melee DPS. So Pelagos is still our go-to. For the Venthyr, however, your Covenant of choice, or your Soulbind of choice, is in fact Nadja. And that is because of her stat amp from both Fatal Flaw and from Thrillseeker. Going into the Conduit, then. Unfortunately, I don't know what the best Soulbinds are for Night Fae and Necrolord. I would recommend going to maybe Wowhead and having a look there. But going into the Conduits, however, I can tell you what they are across the entire board. Ring and Clarity for Kyrian Paladins is a necessity. It is required. The other two potency conduits, however, are slightly less set in stone. Generally speaking, Virtuitous Command will also be locked in because it is a very strong option for both Raiding and Mythic Plus. But the third potency conduit, you have a bit of a playstyle swap up. Generally, you will see Expurgation or Truth's Wake get mentioned more for the third potency conduit in a Mythic Plus setting due to the fact they gain more benefit. Templar's Vindication is only useful if you are casting Templar's Verdict, For a second there, I was about to say Final Verdict, but that's a legendary, and we will get onto that later. So, the option to use Templar's Vindication is very much based on your mindset and your playstyle and how you wish to play, which we will also discuss later. But for any other Covenant, because you don't have Ring and Clarity, your Mythic Plus choices will be Virtuous Command, Expurgation, and then a toss-up between Truth's Wake and Templar's Vindication. So Expurgation becomes your go-to potency. For the Endurance Conduit, for Mythic Plus, specifically, your choice, the recommended choices would be Shielding Words and Condensed Animosphere. Now, Condensed Animosphere is a fantastic passive in that it heals for a percentage of your health whenever you take damage, can occur once every 10 seconds. Whereas Shielding Words, which we were using in the previous season, causes you to gain a shield equal to a percentage of that heal done by Word of Glory. This synergizes very, very well with the talent Healing Hands. However, again, from my personal playing experience, I find that I am using Word of Glory much less, and instead I'm spending that holy power in funneling to do boss damage. So I am actually opting for Divine Call, just to help slowly reduce the Divine Shields through the course of a dungeon. If I can get an extra use out of it, and an extra 2 uses out of it, fantastic. But I will also admit that Divine Call is in there because I also raid as a Retribution Paladin. So, due to the Conduit energy system and constantly swapping back and forth based on my content, I am much more comfortable just keeping Divine Call in there at all times. The Finesse Conduit, we only really have 2 choices. The other 2 are exceptionally niche and as a result not really ever going to be taken. Those 2 choices in question that we have are Lights Barding, which increases the duration of our Divine Steed by a percentage based on the item level of the Conduit. At 239, that is an 85% duration increase. And the other option we have is Echoing Blessings. Echoing Blessings gives our Blessing of Freedom a movement speed increase component by 8% at 226. And Blessing of Sacrifice and Blessing of Protection both then end up with a damage reduction component. So Blessing of Sacrifice, which is a baseline 30% damage reduction on your tank, becomes a 38% damage reduction. The interesting thing to note with Echoing Blessings is the fact that once Blessing of Sacrifice expires, you then also get that 8% damage reduction. So, Echoing Blessings, if you don't need the additional mobility granted to you by Light Barding, Echoing Blessing is very much a given thing for your tank. And your tank will very much appreciate it in certain weeks. Now, gear. Gear is the big part of this. Oh, actually, before we go on to gear, one thing I will say with regards to Soulbinds and the Conduit, the order in which you have the Conduit is important because of the fact that once we get past 55 renown, which will be next week, where we gain the 7th rank at 63 renown, we gain our first Soulbind upgrade, which empowers our potency slots. So at 226 Ring and Clarity, I have a 64% chance to cast Divine Toll up to 3 extra times. Now, once it is empowered, that percentage chance increases. I believe at the maximum item level of the Conduit, it ends up actually increasing it by 8%, so from 72 to 80%, which is massive in terms of increasing the consistency of your burst, specifically your 1-minute bursts, because on a single target encounter, rather than just getting 1 judgment, you might consistently get 3, or even 2, which is additional holy power and allows us to pump faster into things like our execution sentence. But we'll properly discuss talents and rotations and things like that shortly. So the order in your potency conduit is important, because you want Ring and Clarity, or if you're not Kyrian and you're Venthia or something like that, you will want Virtuous Command to be your top ability. So that will then be buffed the most. If you're raiding, however, and you're a different covenant, you will want Templar's Vindication to be your top one. But this is obviously a Mythic Plus setting. So, we've discussed the empowerment side of Conduits now. Let's get into the gear. Now, we're quite fortunate in that Retribution Paladins are item level focused. We care more about strength, respective to our secondary stats. However, there is a breakpoint to mention, and I have alluded to this in previous guides, but 21% is kind of our magic number because it allows us to start getting an extra global in within our execution sentence. And that kind of changes your playstyle a little bit, but again, we will get onto that in a little while. So, item level is king. Then you're probably going to want to get your haste to 21%, and then it's an equal mix of mastery, crit, and versatility. As you can see here, my haste is actually below 17%, and that is because of my trinkets. In particular, I have the raiding trinket Old Warrior's Soul from normal, which drops from Sylvanas, and that particular trinket, once it is at the maximum stacks of 5, while in combat, I gain just a flat 6% haste. So I can afford to be at 17% currently out of combat, because when I am in combat, I then end up at 23%. That's not taking into account anything like food buffs. But the main thing to keep an eye out for when gearing are in fact your trinkets. Rings we can be quite flexible with. You can see I have a very crit and verse heavy ring, and my other ring has haste mastery on it. You may see guides for the ring like the old god's Death God's Signet from the other side. That is also a very good ring. However, rings are the ideal way, rings and neck are the ideal way for you to balance out your stats. So I'd recommend making sure that you sim your character to get your stat weight and I do it maybe on a weekly basis, just to check that you're gearing correctly for your character. Because if you get a piece of gear that is, I don't know, say my legs, they're versatility mastery heavy, and I was to get some 240 plus or even 252 from my mythic chest on Wednesday, and they're all of a sudden really haste crit heavy, then it may turn out that I actually now need more versatility from something. So I may actually need to drop my Signet of the False Accuser to get that little bit more versatility within my gear set. And you will shuffle your gear around. But, general principle, you want item level first. The difference, and this is why trinkets are important, because there are some trinkets that will perform better than others. Inscrutable Quantum Device and the Overwhelming Power Crystal from the Mana Storms, both of these trinkets come from the other side. Let's just open it up to make sure I've got the right name. Yeah, Overwhelming Power Crystal. Both of these trinkets are very, very powerful on-use trinkets that line up or should be used in conjunction with wings. Overwhelming Power Crystal is slightly more forgiving to use, with it only being a 90-second cooldown, so you just macro this in with wings and you use it every time you hit wings. For comparative for its strength, it gives its on-use effect. It does damage to you for 15 seconds, but you could use Shield of Vengeance with it every time it's up, and you'd be able to absorb the damage, proc Shield of Vengeance, but the stat amp that it gives is 439 critical strike at a 210 item level. That is base Mythic 0. Comparatively, that amount of crit is just shy of what my total crit is currently, because my character, as of present, at 240 item level, or yeah, we'll say 240, item level is only 462 crit in total. it almost doubles my total amount of crit from a single trinket. Now, pairing that with the fact that Avenging Wrath gives you an additional 20% chance to crit, I would not be entirely surprised if you could get close to, if not higher than 60, maybe even 65% crit, which would make your wings considerably more powerful because you are much more likely to crit. Because at the moment I only have a 20% chance to crit baseline. So 40% chance to crit with wings up. The other trinket, IQD, is a notorious trinket. It is currently deemed as one of our best. And that is because when it gives stats, and I have a little weak aura here which I will also link in the description below, it gives an insane amount of stats. So if I, without being in combat and without using Seraphim or anything like that, if I use it, it gives me 755 mastery. That brings my mastery up to 70%, which is 69.6% increased holy damage. And pairing, and that's up from 36. So it gives me nearly, well, it gives me 34% mastery. So again, almost doubles my mastery percentage, and actually does go over double my total mastery. Now, a trinket like that paired with Seraphim and Wings at every chance you get is massive. The problem with IQD is it does not line up well with our other cooldowns. It is a 3-minute cooldown versus our Avenging Wrath being 2 minutes, and obviously our 1-minute cooldowns. So you can use it every third 1-minute set and every second wings. So you will cycle between having huge wings and then small wings. Generally, you want to just hold IQD and use it with wings. But if it's not going to give you stats, so if it's going to be an execute, or it's going to help the healer or give mana or something like that, then you should use it on cooldown. And just keep it rolling. Because it will give a substantial amount of mana or health to either yourself or to your healer. Just be careful though, because if you're running with some healers, they will struggle with mana often, and you may not get as much benefit out of your IQD as possible. Another good one to use if you're, or another couple of good trinkets to use, is the trinket from Plaguefall. The, what's it called? Vial of Putrefaction, that's it. This is a very strong passive trinket, and does quite a lot of single target damage. Every 5 seconds it applies a dot to your target for 30 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. Now, even in AoE situations, it still gets benefit. Rather than necessarily stacking all 3 on one particular target, you may end up with 3 or 4 stacks out on different targets. So it's very much once it's on, forget about it and do good damage. The other good trinket in question, and this is aimed more at those that like to PvP, would be the Gladiator's Badge of Ferocity. Now, it's a crit stat trinket, but its on use is a huge amount of primary stat, 204 at item level 226. To get to 226, you just need to be 1400 in rated PvP, which is quite manageable for a lot of people. Although if you can get higher, then fully recommended, because the power of this particular trinket is in that it lines up perfectly with your 1-minute burst, and subsequently every wings you will have it. It results in a lot more damage, again, because our primary stat is our main scaling factor. So more strength we have, the more damage we do. So we've discussed the gear. Now we're going to talk about the legendaries, the talents, and the playstyle, kind of all wrapped into one segment here. But we will start with the legendary specifically. Now, Retribution Paladin has a couple of legendaries available to them. We have the Divine Resonance legendary as Kyrian, and I'll get onto that shortly. We then have Tempest of the Lightbringer as legs, and we also have available to us the Final Verdict legendary. If you're Kyrian, your legendary choice will be either Divine Resonance or Tempest of the Lightbringer, because Divine Resonance is now also our strongest single target legendary and beats Final Verdict. If you're any other Covenant, your choices will be between Tempest of the Lightbringer, Final Verdict, or alternatively Mad Paragons. Mad Paragons is much stronger for Venthia Paladins though. But for a Mythic Plus setting, you're either going to be running with Tempest of the Lightbringer, which augments your Divine Storms by projecting them as an additional wave of light, striking all enemies up to 20 yards in front of you for 20% of the damage that your Divine Storm did, or you will be using Divine Resonance if you're Kyrian. Now, why am I saying use Divine Resonance? Well, let's go into the talents a little bit first, and then we will discuss why I suggest using Divine Resonance over Tempest of the Lightbringer. So we have two options really when we play, and we have the 1 minute build within Mythic Plus, which still uses Execution Sentence and Final Reckoning. There is another build which isn't as single target focused and is more consistency based, at which point you're looking at using Zeal rather than Execution Sentence. Because every time you Judgment, Zeal will empower your next 3 auto attacks to attack 30% faster and deal additional holy damage. Remember, because of our mastery that increases holy damage, all of these things that say deal holy damage therefore get amplified by our abilities. So let's just check if the cooldown's off. It is. Right, so we're going to use the IQD. We're going to increase our mastery. So we got 36.1%. So we use IQD, and all of a sudden it's gone up from 180 to 227 damage. So we gain almost 50 additional damage per swing because our mastery's higher. So just take that into account and remember. The other option, using Execution Sentence, however, is much more priority target focused, because you are pumping as much damage as you can into one target every minute. Now, my personal recommendation would be to use Execution Sentence and play into our strengths as a paladin, but if you're looking to be more AoE consistent from pack to pack to pack, then I'd recommend going with Zeal. Either of these two builds will get you your 15s every week comfortably. The difference will be in whether or not you want to be good, or if you want to be the type of guy that blows your group away and you start getting questions at the end of the dungeon, how did you do that? Which is obviously how I play, because I am striving to break the meta. I want to prove to certain guides and certain writers that Ret Paladins are not B tier for Mythic Plus, and we can in fact go toe-to-toe with A and some S tier classes. We might not have the utility, but we certainly have the damage, and I am doing my best to help you guys and myself get there and prove that to them. So, Execution Sentence is my go-to. Actually, before we go on to the second tier, I will say now that with Execution Sentence in particular, it double dips. It will take the debuff from Judgment when you apply it, because it's a Holy Power spender, so it will therefore be amplified by that, but simultaneously, if you use it after a Final Reckoning, it will also be amplified by your Final Reckoning. The result of that is I can frequently get my Execution Sentences to hit for between 42 to about 52,000 damage. For a single ability. That's without any stat amp. I have, in certain dungeons, however, and in certain situations been able to get that execution sentence to hit for upwards of 70 to 100 odd K. My 17 Mists of Tyr Aside is a perfect example of that, and it shows just how powerful this build can be when used correctly. There are a few other additions to it, and we will go into that because the Seasonal 2 Affix gives us a lot of power if we can play around it correctly. So, but we will go into that once we've covered the playstyle choices and before we get onto the rotations. So, the second tier. You will see guides that recommend a choice between Blade of Wrath or Imperium Power. Now, Blade of Wrath has its uses, but they are primarily single target. Maybe a Tyrannical week, you might want to try and play around with this. But unfortunately, this is the nature of, do you want a single target proc? Or do you want an AoE proc? Bearing in mind that Divine Storm, even with a single target priority build, Divine Storm is still going to be the majority of your damage throughout the course of a dungeon, to the likelihood of it being greater than 30% of your total damage, because you still need to contribute 2 packs as you're going through. The point where you then shine as a single target priority is if there is a mob that needs to die immediately within a pack. A fantastic example of this is Zav's Wing within Theatre of Pain. There is the Commander and the Arbalist pack just after the second large single target mob that you need to defeat as you go round towards Zav. That Commander causes the other target to take less damage, and as a result the Commander needs to die. Same with Spies of Ascension. So as a Retribution Paladin, we can blow that up. But while we're blowing it up, using things like Imperium Power is still beneficial to the group. However, those particular situations, you do need to be wary of threat, but we can go into that later. So my recommendation would be to use Imperium Power because it is more consistently beneficial to your group than Blade of Wrath would be. I will, however, say that Blade of Wrath will potentially get more benefit if you are using the Expurgation Conduit, because of the fact that Expurgation leaves a dot on the target when you crit. So a build that could work with this talent would be if you had the Overwhelming Power Crystal and Blade of Wrath during Wings windows, because you are much more likely to crit, therefore leaving the dot on your targets. But, as I said, for the guide purposes, I would recommend using Imperium Power. The third tier row is your CC options. Now, a lot of people and a lot of guides will just say run Fist of Justice, and that is the easiest choice to run. If you wish to just focus on that, then by all means. Because every 10 holy power you spend, or 10 spenders you use, so every 30 holy power, you get your judgment back, or not your judgment, you get your stun back. This is because each holy power spent reduces the remaining cooldown of Hammer and Justice by 2 seconds. So that means every 3 power that's spent on a Templar's Verdict or a Divine Storm is a 6-second stun reduction for the cooldown. However, Repentance and Blinding Light do need proper mentions. Repentance has its place in groups where you don't have things like Hex, Para, Imprison, Sap, Polymorph, and single targeted CC options. Primarily for things such as inspiring mobs, menders, healers, or just generally if you want to reduce the pack on pull. And want to split up different mobs because you don't have enough kicks or whatever else. So it gets the least amount of use, but if you're in the comp and it is required, you can swap to it and you can help your group out. There are some situations where even our turn evil CC option, which affects aberrations, undead, and demons and causes them to flee, can see some use. So as a paladin, you have those abilities to be that extra CC for a group. Blinding Light, on the other hand, is an AoE disorientate. It breaks on damage that isn't holy, so in 9 out of 10 cases will break immediately after you use it. However, because it is AoE, it can be used as a mass interrupt, for spellcasters, or in some cases can actually be used as a kiting tool for your tank. It can give your tank enough time to roll out, jump out, or hell, just give them that extra second they need to be able to just get out of melee range of a problematic add. And isn't all that difficult to use once you're in the thick of it. So Spies of Ascension being a good example. Plaguefall also. The Arden Wheel segment within the other side. Halls of Atonement. You get the idea. It has a lot of uses. The only downside is it had a 90-second cooldown. So you have to be mindful of when you use it and not use it at the wrong time. The fourth tier row is a choice between Unbreakable Spirit and Cavalier. Eye of the Storm, or Eye for an Eye, is only really a PvP talent, so we don't really need to discuss that here. Cavalier gives you 2 charges of Divine Steed, which greatly helps with the mobility issue. But my personal recommendation would be to use Unbreakable Spirit. The reason for this is it reduces the cooldown of Divine Shield, Shield of Vengeance, and Lay on Hands by 30%. Now, the big part of this is it affects Lay on Hands. Now, Lay on Hands is usually a 10-minute cooldown, but with Unbreakable Spirit becomes a 7-minute cooldown. Now, Unbreakable Spirit paired with Healing Hands is a very potent combination if you're willing to be proactive and help the group out in tight healing situations as you're trying to push your keys, especially if your healer is undergeared or new to the role, or even in some cases if your healer has a lot on their plate, because it will take your 10-minute cooldown and put it to a 3-minute cooldown, but we'll get onto Healing Hands in a moment. The other benefit of Unbreakable Spirit is the frequency in which you can then use Shield of Vengeance or even Divine Shield. Divine Shield becomes a 3.5-minute cooldown rather than a 5-minute cooldown. So in some cases, you can get multiple benefits out of it where you would only really see the one. So you can ignore certain mechanics or be a little bit more liberal with its use if you want to try and avoid threat. I previously mentioned that threat is a big problem for Retribution Paladins, and that's specifically Kyrians because of the way Divine Toll works. Divine Toll will hit up to 5 targets. However, it will hit those 5 targets with a single target ability. So some tanks, such as Brewmaster Monks, struggle with threat, and I did briefly discuss this in my 17 Mists of Tirna Scythe video because their threat is actually target capped. Their Cake Smash only hits 5 targets, whereas other tanks are soft capped. So if you're running Unbreakable Spirit, you can almost get to a stage where you can bubble all your big burst. If you know that you're going to go for a big 3-minute burst with your IQD and you're going to slap everything in a pack and murder things, pre-bubble. Or bubble once you get in there, because you will see if you're running or if you have your threat enabled so you can see it, you will see when it goes high threat. And you know at that point you're likely to rip a target off your tank. And you really don't want that, because once you get to these higher keys, if a mob turns around and slaps you one, you're probably going to need to see the doctor. It's going to hurt. So being able to bubble when you know, or try and preempt the bubble, you can also use Bop for this same reason. Although Bop still remains a 5-minute cooldown, you can try and alternate to reduce the threat that you're creating, making your tank's life easier. The amount of times I've been in a group with another Ret Paladin, or I've been tanking for a Ret Paladin, and they have just popped everything and died within 3 seconds of pulling a pack, because I've gone in, I've smacked everything once, I've tried to clump it all up into a death ball, or I've seen the tank try and do it, and this other Ret Paladin has gone in, slapped everything as hard as he can. Yes, his DPS looks amazing for those 3 seconds, but then everything's just turned around and clobbered him on, and he's now having to do the run of shame back from the graveyard. Or from the front of the dungeon in the case of things like Halls of Atonement. That's when you know it's the Walk of Shame. Anyway, on to the next tier. Unfortunately, for Retribution Paladins, it doesn't matter what covenant you are locked into Seraphim. You could, if you really want to play the passive way, use Divine Purpose, but you will not get the benefit out of it, and it will actively hamper your DPS because it is a proc. It is not consistent, and although it may pan out and may be easier to use for beginners, at which point I would probably recommend starting with this for lower keys as a build, with both Zeal and Divine Purpose until you get the hang of certain abilities. But Execution and Seraphim are the better choices. The reason for Seraphim is locked in so hard is because for 3 Holy Power, every 45 seconds for 15, so basically it's off cooldown, or you get it for a third of its cooldown. It increases your haste, crit, and versatility by 8% flat, and increases your mastery by 13%. So, if you remember, IQD brings my mastery up to 70%, plus the 13% from Seraphim. 83% mastery during my burst. So that is an increase in holy damage of over 50% from my current stats. And that's still not taking into account the seasonal affixes. So it's very, very, very strong. The next tier, you have a choice between Healing Hands or Selfless Healer. Selfless Healer you generally see more use of in the PvP world due to the nerf to Shielding Hands. Shielding Words, sorry. And the nerf to Word of Glory. And what this does is, every time you spend Holy Power, it reduces the cast time of your Flash of Light by 25%, stacking up to 4 times. So you can have a free instant cast Flash of Light that does 40% additional healing to a target, which is, it's alright for passive off healing. It is alright. However, Healing Hands, if you're willing to spend the Holy Power, can be a lot stronger. The other bonus of Healing Hands is the way that it interacts with Lay on Hands. Lay on Hands' cooldown is reduced by up to 60% based on the target's missing health. If your target has 30% health or less when you cast it on them, the Lay on Hands becomes that a 3-minute cooldown, which means you can get a lot more use out of it out of a dungeon. And in some coordinated groups, your tank will then be able to play around with that as a safety net, or your healer can. However, you need to coordinate it. I personally have made quite a few mistakes with Necrolords that are running the Hermia tree because they come back to life when they die. My UI doesn't actually tell me that, so I can see them at 1% health. I use Lay on Hands and my Lay on Hands gets eaten. However, because I used it when they're at such low health, it's only a 3-minute cooldown, so I'm not as punished for it for being proactive. I have, on multiple occasions though, also used it to great effect. I've heard my healer over comms go, "Oh, bugger," and start panicking, and I've immediately just Lay on Hands to target that has the lowest percentage health within the group. Because it's immediately a case of, right, okay, you don't need to worry about that person. In the process, I can also bubble myself, perhaps, or I'm using Shield of Vengeance and Blessing of Sacrifice on the tank, and reducing the damage that the tank's taking by 30%, while also shielding myself, and giving the healer a chance to breathe. The Word of Glory component, however, based on the target's missing health, Word of Glory can have its healing increased by up to 100%. This means that in some situations, your Word of Glories will hit for nearly 27-30k, which, if it crits for 27k, is probably close to about 60% of my current total health. And for some people is a significant heal and will get them out of the danger zone, all for a single Word of Glory, especially if a pack is dying or you're in a position where you've got 3-5 Holy Power, Blade of Justice is about to come off cooldown, you've got Judgment and Crusader Strike either side of it, and you can go, right, Word of Glory, Blade of Judgment, or Blade of Justice, Judgment, Crusader Strike into another Word of Glory. Just to get people topped up on 2 different targets. It will differentiate you from the single player minded Retribution Paladin and the group focused one, and will get you invited into additional groups. The final choice is between Final Reckoning and Sanctified Wrath, for Kyrians at least. For Venthirs, Crusade has a place, especially with Mad Paragons and Ashen Hollow usage, but generally speaking, Final Reckoning or Sanctified Wrath. My recommendation here is Final Reckoning because it is another 1 minute cooldown we can use, whereas Sanctified Wrath removes that and basically further amps our Avenging Wrath. In doing so, it means that our damage profile is much more lined up with our 2 minute cooldown, which in some situations is great, but unfortunately, because we are a melee player and not something like a fire mage, we are unlikely to have our cooldown played around with in mind for a Mythic Plus. So a tank's not going to go, right, the Paladin has wings in 30 seconds, he's using Sanctified Wrath, let's go big, let's have a big pull. They're not going to think like that because you're a melee, which means that if a mechanic goes wrong, you need to move out, and if you need to move out, you're not getting benefit of wings because you're not there smacking things. Because what Sanctified Wrath does is every time you spend Holy Power, you AoE pulse for nearby damage. That's it. It's just an AoE pulse. If you can't be in melee range for a second, and, you know, or something just moves out, the mobs in Theatre of Pain being a prime example, they leap around. Those small little things going to Gorchop's section will leap around. If they leap at the wrong time, your wings is pointless. Whereas Final Reckoning, being a 1 minute cooldown, front loads a lot of your damage. So an ideal opener would be your tank pulls everything into place, you target the big guy is going to die, you generate your Holy Power, an AoE stun comes in from your Shaman, your Monk, your... Hell, you can even use Wake of Ashes during your burst as an AoE stun. Whether it DRs them or not, it holds them in place. So you go into your rotation, you burst, you Final Reckoning, it does a huge amount of upfront damage. Single target, my Final Reckonings usually hit for about 20k. With wings and everything up. Now imagine that in an AoE situation. It claps. It can cause a threat problem, which is why you need to be mindful of it, but generally speaking, especially for a consistency point of view, Final Reckoning you will get much more benefit out of because you can use it every minute. And even on single target, it does a substantial amount of damage. So even if targets do move out when you use it, you will still get benefit from it, unlike if they were to move out while you had wings up. Because you got to remember, we are melee, unfortunately, which means uptime is something we need to consider. So, the playstyle and the legendaries. Now we've discussed the talents. You can see that my preference is for a single target priority build. And I have previously released a video going into this. And the reason I have this preference is because Paladins are capable of some of the scariest burst in the game. And this is without being augmented by other people. There's 2 reasons for this in the current season. One of them is the seasonal affix, in that we get anima powers. And the second is just the nature of our damage and our scaling. As we get more strength and we get more secondary stats, our damage is going to progressively get more consistent, but also scarier, in that our numbers are going to be much larger. Now, we don't have the highest damage outside of our cooldowns, and I'll be the first to admit that. But this single target priority build means that those moments where we are bursting and we are deciding that something's going to die, we will top the meters. There's not many times I will be beaten during single target burst or priority target burst when it needs to happen. So I've gone into packs and I've just single targeted one mob. I haven't used Divine Storm, I've used Templar's Verdict, and I've been in a group, and the rest of the group have all done their AoEs. There's been Earthquakes Down, there's been Spinning Crane Kicks, there's been Flame Patches, or whatever else, depending on the group I'm in, and I have still come out as top DPS. That's how scary we can be. But the reason for this, and I'll go on, I'll discuss the Legendaries in a second, and where that goes into it. But the Seasonal 2 Affix in particular, there are two powers, or two mobs that you really care about. The Incinerator and the Executioner. Now, the reason we care about those two in particular is because they're the ones that provide the damage animate powers. And the one in question that we really care about is Champion's Brand. Champion's Brand, when above 70% health, will give you either Mastery or Crit, based on whichever stat is highest. Now, for Retribution Paladins, generally, 9 times out of 10, that will be Mastery. And one Champion's Brand from one of them will provide about a 5% holy damage increase. So when you get both of them, that is 10% increased damage during your burst when you are, or when you need it. However, you do need to be above 70% health. So if you can coordinate with your healer, or if you're able to use health stones, or your Kyrian Vial to ensure that before you burst, you are at or above 70% HP, you will hit like a dump truck. Because that means that whereas I was with Seraphim and IQD at 83% mastery, I'm now nearly at 100% mastery. Yeah. It starts stacking. The other anima power that you can look for is the Volcanic Plume, which is more of a utility-based one, and that it will throw targets up into the air, interrupting casts and causing them to flail around a bit. Quite funny to watch. It does a considerable amount of damage. It doesn't do as much, but it does help with the consistency for AoE. And the necrotic daggers, so applying necrotic stacks to a target, although isn't our best because we don't attack fast enough to stack it as easily as other classes, it may also still be worth taking to help the group because it does reduce the healing that those targets take, and also reduces any absorbs that they may have. So these anima powers kind of go quite nicely into the playstyle idea, because if you want to play single target focused or priority target focused and you want to blow the bosses up, then the recommended combination would be to use Divine Resonance as our single target legendary, because we also get benefit from it from AoE situations, because it just casts Judgment every 5 seconds for 15 seconds after casting Divine Toll. Now, if you tap target and have a weak aura that enables you to keep an eye on it, then you can cleave Judgments out onto additional targets into Divine Storms, still buffing those Divine Storms. It's not as impressive for consistent AoE pressure throughout a dungeon, unlike Tempest of the Lightbringer, but it will have its place. Comparatively, if you wish to go down the route of that consistent AoE DPS, rather than using the full 1 minute build, you could swap to Zeal, swap to your Tempest of the Lightbringer legendary legs, and your second DPS anima power, rather than being Champion's Brand, doubling down on the mastery and the single target pressure that we could provide, you could go for the Volcanic Plumage, helping enhance your AoE contribution from a pack to pack. It will hinder your single target DPS somewhat when it comes to the bosses, but that is entirely up to you and how you wish to play. So we've discussed those as a whole, so talents, legendaries, and kind of the playstyle options. What we will now discuss briefly will be the rotation. Now, there's a lot of rotations out there that you can use, but generally speaking, you want to use Judgment on cooldown. You want to make sure that your Blade of Wrath or Blade of Justice is used on cooldown, and your Crusader strikes are weaved in. You will find at certain haste points or at certain points throughout your rotation, you will end up with dead spots where you don't have anything to press because you're waiting a second here or there to press something. This is where add-ons such as Helkali, which I will link below, can come in quite useful. Now, the burst in particular has a certain speed to it. You will want to generate to 3 to 4 holy power, then use Seraphim, then build again. While you have that additional haste, crit, mastery and versatility, into then using your wings, a trinket if you're having IQD or overwhelming power crystal, into wings, into final reckoning, into execution sentence. Now you want to make sure that you still have the judgment debuff on the target at this point. So generally speaking, I will go into my pull on the boss is usually Judgment, Blade of Wrath, Crusader Strike, Consecration, Seraphim, Crusader Strike, Blade of Justice, and then I go into Wings, Final Reckoning, Execution Sentence. And my Execution Sentence is taking that Judgment debuff and also being empowered by my Final Reckoning. At which point, once Execution Sentence is on the target, you then go into your Divine Toll, hopefully Ring and Clarity procs. If it does, then you can go into a Templar's Verdict or a Divine Storm, depending on if this is single target or AoE. If you're in an AoE situation, you are guaranteed to get 5, well, you're guaranteed to get at least 3 holy power, so you can go straight into a Divine Storm. Then you wake into another spender, and then you just generate your single target rotation from there, making sure that you spend your holy power accordingly, either your Divine Storms or your Templar's Verdict. My recommendation generally is if it's 2 targets plus, Divine Storm, unless there's one big bad. So bolstering week like this week, inspiring, or if you're just in a particular pack and your tank says, I want that thing to die first because it hurts, then maybe alternate between Divine Storming to help the group out or just Templar's Verdicting. But I leave that to your judgment call. The Consecration usage in particular needs to be mentioned now. Now, I've said I tend to use Consecration in my dead spots after Seraphim. And that is because I have enough haste and enough gear that I'm not punished for it. Because generally what you want to do is you want to pump as much damage as you physically can into that window after Seraphim with Final Reckoning and Execution Sentence, because you want to keep Seraphim for as long as you can. You do not want to use it too early and have it then waste away on you and expire before you can get your Execution Sentence off, because you still want that increased mastery for when Execution Sentence detonates. So, if you don't have a lot of haste, use Consecration before you Seraphim, because Consecration will dynamically adjust to your stats based on tick rates, because Blizzard got rid of snapshotting. Now, for those of you that don't know, well, I say they got rid of snapshotting. Certain abilities do snapshot, but the majority of them don't, because a long time ago in Blizzard's game design, there used to be snapshotting where every time you'd cast a spell, it would snapshot your stats. And this became a huge problem back in Mists of Pandaria, and specifically Throne of Thunder for casters, because there was a trinket that gave you 100% crit chance from Lei Shen. And as a result of snapshotting, people would fish for that proc, and things like Affliction Warlocks would then apply all their dots while they had that proc, and then leave them to expire, fish again, and then do that. So Blizzard changed snapshotting for the most part, and as a result, things now dynamically adjust to your stats. So if you put Consecration down first, then Seraphim, Consecration will dynamically adjust. However, you still want to ensure certain abilities like execution sentence benefit the most from your stats, because you do not want it snapshotting the other way. Or not snapshotting the other way, dynamically adjusting, rather, the other way. So you don't want it to decrease in damage because you've just lost 13% mastery. So, into the add-ons, Weakauras, and things like that. Now, I use I use 3 major add-ons for... I use 1 major add-on and 3 major Weakauras. The major add-on in question that I'm using is the Helkali add-on, which is designed for rotational abilities, or rotational awareness. So, as you can see on my screen, I have Arcane Torrent, Judgment, and Blade of Wrath highlighted on my screen. They are the order in which I should do something if I target something. And I'm going to go into combat. Before the pull, Arcane Torrent, because that gives me Holy Power as a Blood Elf. Into Judgment, because that has the greatest range at being a 30-yard range ability. Into Blade of Justice, which is a 12-yard range abilities I'm running in. And then it will then prompt me based on suggestions of my gear and the position of my rotational abilities, like how many charges of Crusader Strike do I have, what's the recharge time on it, and it will help build up that muscle memory for how to open, or it will give you suggestions based on your situation, and it will dynamically adjust. Oh, Divine Toll just cleaved 3 targets. Maybe you should Divine Storm rather than Templar's Verdict. And it'll come up with things like that. The Weakauras in question that I use a Kick Weakaura that will track who does what when. So if I go to my Mythic Plus Interrupt Tracker, a little bar comes up here. Whenever someone kicks, their name will be here and it will track their kicks. This is a fantastic thing to help prevent overlapping of kicks. And sometimes you can coordinate as well if you're using voice comms. I will put its link in the description below, along with the other 2 that I have. One is for IQD, and it will tell me what stats it is likely to give me. Or, well, it will say stats, heal, CC break, execute, mana. And it will tell you which of those it will give you. And then down here, it tells you which stat it gave you specifically. Sometimes it will be haste, other times it will be mastery for me. There are some occasions where I have also got verse as well, but they generally tend to be when I'm in my tanking environment. The final one is specific to Kyrian, and that is a cooldowner, or it is a timer that basically informs me when my free judgments are coming out. And these are the points where I know in AoE situations to tap target. Either tap target or to not press judgment, because you do not want to overlap your judgments. Unfortunately, the debuffs do not overlap, they just overwrite. So rather than having, say, 2 stacks of judgment on a target, or a judgment that is stronger than others, in that rather than it being increased 25% damage, it's, I don't know, 30 or 40% increased damage. Unfortunately, judgment doesn't work like that. It just overwrites it. So you want to try and minimize that. So you go into free judgment, spender, generate spender, generate spender. If it can be done. And at some point it will be once we have the gear. But you do want to try and minimize. See it lights up. 2, 1, and then I get my free one. So they're the ones I use. Now, macros as a final note, I tend to use mouse over macros, and if it's something that you want to do, I will put a template mouse over macro in the description below. But if you're not used to mouse over macros, my recommendation would be to practice with one ability, and that would be Cleanse Toxins. The reason for that is Cleanse Toxins doesn't have a large cost associated to it, and in certain dungeons, primarily Plaguefall, you will see a lot of benefit out of it if you're with a healer that cannot dispel diseases. So something like a Resto Druid, or a Shaman, maybe. And In doing so, you will massively help out the tank, especially when it comes to the second segment between the first and the second boss. Because those plague rocks and those slimes do an incredible amount of damage to your tank. They also reduce the amount of health and stats that your tank has, making your tank very, very squishy. So if you want to practice with mouse over macros, that would be my first recommendation. After that, I'd then recommend practicing with Blessing of Sacrifice and getting comfortable using that on a group. Then Bop. And whether or not you use a target of target macro or still remain using a mouse over macro is up to you for Bop, because Bop is a rather unique one. Because if your tank's not prepared for it, you will cause a wipe to a group, because you will bop them and they will lose all thread. Your tank needs to know about it beforehand. And then finally, I would then have your healing spells macroed. Again, same style, mouse over or target of target. And the reason for that is because you want to primarily focus on dealing damage to your target. But there will be situations where a powerful Word of Glory or a Lay on Hands can save the group. But you need to be comfortable and you need to be prepared to stand by your decision, as it were, because you are using potentially a 10-minute cooldown or 7-minute cooldown if you're using the right talent. And it could have been a case of, yeah, you spent that 3 holy power to help heal, or that 12 holy power over the course of a fight to help heal. But if you'd spent that 12 holy power to do damage, then the target might have died 5 seconds faster, for instance, which would have made your healer's life easier. So yeah, my recommendation for the macro side of things would be to start with Cleanse Toxins, get comfortable, know what you can and can't handle, and then slowly build up your defensives and then into your healing last. Because once you get to the stage of proactively helping your healer, you're at that position where 15s are no longer a problem and you're pushing those higher keys. So, in summary then, in this little deep dive, we have covered Covenants, Soulbinds, the Conduits themselves, gear, Legendries, the various playstyle options we have available to us, and things about our rotation. Hopefully, this hour and a bit long video has helped you guys, and if it has, please like and comment below, and also it'd be greatly appreciated if you'd also hit that subscribe button. But if it hasn't helped you, please comment below. Let me know why. What else would you like to know? And I will happily get back to you with that information, either written or in another video format. In the meantime though, my name's Aura, and I hope you all have a lovely day, and thank you for watching. Catch you later, folks.